They say their fear of what might happen in Egypt outweighed their worry over safety in Iraq.
I think things accelerated just like this. Nobody was expecting that.
These are not your huddled masses. This is Iraq's middle class. It's professors and engineers and accountants. They're needed here, but almost all want to go back to Egypt as soon as things settle. It started to become worse, says this master's student. All the banks were closed. We couldn't get cash. What's happening in Egypt is sending shockwaves throughout the region. Hardly anyone here would ever have dreamed that what's happening would make Iraq seem stable by comparison. Uday Latif Daoud left in the height of the civil war and was worried about coming back here with his 3-month-old twins.
It was becoming worse day by day, especially a shortage of gasoline and bread. That's why we were afraid events would escalate.
It was the breakdown of law and order that prompted the decision to evacuate citizens, says Iraq's foreign minister. Exactly what so many were fleeing here when they left.
Many of them settled in Egypt because of the security challenges, because of the violence, because of the sectarian killing in the streets of Baghdad and other cities, of the car bombs. Now they are the ones who are seeking safety in their home country.
In the Baghdad cafes, people watch this revolution in the making with fascination. When Iraqis in southern and northern Iraq rose up against Saddam Hussein after the 1991 war, they were shot in the streets. It was more than a decade later that U.S. forces toppled Saddam.
Any authentic nation that enjoys a long civilization would prefer that change comes from within.
Egypt has seen a relatively peaceful uprising, they say, but it's not over yet. Jane Araf, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
So that's a report on some of the people that have left due to the deteriorating situation, but you are looking at many of the people that have stayed. This is a shot of Tahrir Square, Liberation Square, where protesters have still gathered despite a night of violence. We can now go to one of our correspondents, one of our Al Jazeera's very own journalists who is in and amongst that square. Can you tell us where you are and what is happening there?
Sure, it's a very tense atmosphere downtown. I've been trying to get to Tahrir Square all morning. The first time I set out, there were groups of about 4 or 5 people, many of them with bloody faces, many of them carrying weapons. They look like they've been there all night. And they are roaming around, stopping foreigners. I was held at knife point for a minute and then chased back to my hotel. I've also seen the army deploying, and they've deployed several dozen additional soldiers in the area near the state television building and near the foreign ministry along the Corniche. That's the route yesterday that the Mubarak supporters took. They crossed over the 26th of July bridge and then they came down the Corniche. So it looks like the army is reinforcing a bit in that area, probably in anticipation of more Mubarak supporters who are expected to come in today.
I want to pick up on what you said about being held at knife point and told to return to your hotel. We're hearing that many more protesters might be heading to the square today. Do you think that is going to be an issue?
We've heard from both pro-Mubarak and anti-Mubarak groups that there are more protesters expected. I've spoken to several activists this morning on the phone who are in Tahrir Square, and they said they know of groups of pro-democracy protesters who are planning to come later this morning, early this afternoon. And then, again, there are reports that there are these groups of Mubarak supporters that are forming up in neighborhoods around the city and planning to head downtown. So it seems like both sides are planning to send more. The army has tried to block off the square. They've tried to block off access to it. So it's not clear how they all plan on getting into the square. But again, it does sound like both sides are sending more people here today.
Let me just update our viewers on what they're seeing right now. This is one of the entrances to Tahrir Square, that's Liberation Square, where protesters have gathered. They've been there for over 24 hours ago. There were said to be about 1 million of them overnight. There were clashes. Numbers have dwindled slightly, but it seems like they are building up again. There's a tank stationed at one of the entrances of the square. Can you tell us what the general atmosphere there is like especially after yesterday's tensions?
It's very tense. The crowd seemed more aggressive than yesterday. The Mubarak supporters seemed more aggressive again. Like I said, there are people roaming around, brandishing weapons about in plain sight. the army just appears outnumbered. There are a few tanks parked near the entrance to Tahrir Square that runs by the Egyptian Museum, and there are maybe about a dozen or so soldiers standing outside of those tanks, and they are essentially surrounded by a crowd of maybe 40 or 50 Mubarak supporters. There's no violence going on, but it's clear that they have the numbers, and the army is sort of standing by helplessly at this point.
Does it seem like the army is going to play any role from this? What kind of a sense are you getting from them?
From the people that I've spoken to in the square, they said they don't expect the army will get any more involved today than it did yesterday, which is to say, not at all. I mean, I saw soldiers yesterday ducking into tanks when people started throwing rocks over their heads. The soldiers didn't try to intervene. They just ducked into their tanks and closed the doors, or in some cases even abandoned the vehicle. So the army is not expected to take a more active role today. We've seen a few more soldiers show up, but they haven't really sent in the kind of numbers they would need to take control of the situation.
I'd like to know about the leadership right now. We've heard some opposition voices, with El Baradei saying that Mubarak will be held responsible for what they call a massacre. Does it seem like there's any opposition group that might be trying to take charge?
No, not really. And again, going back to some of the interviews that I've done this morning, I spoke to one woman who's been in the square since early yesterday. She was there overnight. And when we spoke this morning, she said there wasn't really any high-level organization. She said she's spoken to people who have organized small groups in neighborhoods, groups of pro-democracy protesters to come to the square today. But she said there's nobody at a high level who is directing what's going on. And you're right, we haven't heard much from many of the leading political figures. Many of them have stayed silent over the last 24 hours.
Now, it's interesting, as you're gauging people around you, we spoke to someone earlier who was a protester, and they said after Mubarak's announcement that he would step down in September, they decided to call off their protest and are calling on people in the square to go home. Is there a sense that that sentiment is spreading, or is that just a very concentrated point of view?
I think the sense that I've gotten is the people who are in the square, who are still in the square, who have been there for 10 days, who have been there through all of the clashes with the Mubarak supporters, they are not leaving. But in some of the conversations that I've had with Egyptians in other parts of Cairo, away from downtown, in some of the residential neighborhoods, I have heard people say, you know, Mubarak announced that he's stepping down. He announced that he's not going to run for another term. And so that's enough. So now they should go home. And there's sort of a sense among some people that they want Cairo to go back to normalcy. And they think whether he steps down now or in 6 months, they know he's leaving. And so they just want to see these protests end.
And tell us what kind of messages you're hearing from the media or even the internet.
The internet, now that it's back, it came back yesterday. It's been back for about 24 hours now. So obviously a lot of talk among activists who use things like Twitter and Facebook and some of the opposition media here in Egypt to initially organize these protests. They haven't had access to that for the last week. So they have really come back. There's been a resurgence of activity on social networking sites, on some of the opposition media websites. The Egyptian media, both print and television, have really been trying to downplay the protest. They've been trying to make the pro-democracy protesters out to be the instigators, the rabble-rousers in many cases.
And do you think their role is going to pick up again now that people have internet?
I think it will. I think there's already a lot of talk. One of the people that I spoke to earlier today said she was online earlier this morning and saw a lot on Facebook trying to organize for tomorrow, for Friday, immediately following midday prayers. And so I think that's where we're going to see maybe a big role for some of this online activism, is organizing marches and demonstrations and trying to get a huge number of people into downtown Cairo tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you very much for that update. I understand you are making your way to Tahrir Square. We'll, of course, be speaking to you again later. Now, Ala Abd El Fattah is a well-known blogger and democracy activist. She spoke to us a short while ago to give us a sense of the sentiment in Cairo's Liberation Square.
We knew what we were confronting, and it was very much by choice. We had to confront the police state and break the police by, sacrificing our bodies and taking this risk. But these were mobs let loose on us, surrounding us from all directions. It was, very intense, very. I can't even say the point of it was to disperse us from the square because we were completely surrounded. There was no place to retreat. So I can't imagine that they wanted anything except to have a massacre. In exchange for each martyr, you get unlimited anger. Because we succeeded in resisting, I think this means that we continue to be, very determined. I used to watch these things happen in places like Palestine and wonder, from where you get this courage. And I've been an activist and in confrontations with the police for a few years now, but I still never understood where this comes from. And today I experienced it, and I still don't know where it comes from. I had to pull back elderly men who were insisting on helping in throwing rocks because we have enough young people that there's no point in someone who is, old to do it. I had to pull back university professors and just tell them, please sit down in the middle of the square. When the first martyr fell by gunshot, it was a bit shocking, and people were discussing, whether we should spread the information or whether it would have a very negative impact on morale. And I heard people saying it's an honor, and I envy him. It is like people really wanted to offer their lives on that day, and I can't. I don't know what comes next, but if we're willing to die for it, then I don't think we can be defeated, and I don't think this is going to stop.
As you can hear there, it's been very emotional and sometimes distressing. This is the morning view of what's happening in Cairo. What you are looking at on your TV screens is one of the entrances to Tahrir Square, or Liberation Square. As you can see, a tank has been stationed outside. Tanks ring the square, hoping to keep security. But people are still milling in the square and gathering there. There are both pro-democracy protesters, and we're also hearing pro-Mubarak supporters gathering in many places. We have one of our correspondents in that square right now, and we can go to him right now. Tell us what's happening.
The daylight here has given way to some very extraordinary images as to what is happening in Tahrir Square. It has taken us a little bit longer than usual to get into the heart of the square because, as we are reporting, so many of the entrances into Tahrir Square now have been barricaded off. The protesters here, the anti-government protesters, the pro-democracy protesters, have managed to actually use a lot of the construction material that was at one of the construction sites nearby, big metal rods, big metal screens, and slabs of steel. They've been able to actually break them off overnight and put them up as reinforcements into all of the entrances of Tahrir Square. Now, there is one alleyway which seems to be the focal point of the confrontation now between the pro-Mubarak supporters and the anti-government protesters here, and that is right between the National Museum and adjacent to the 6th of October bridge. Inside Tahrir Square, extraordinary images. People, hundreds of people pouring in to one of the main bridges here, bringing with them medicine, food, water. People here, I've seen a lot of volunteer doctors coming in to provide whatever medical relief they can to those that have been wounded. It is a scene of a battleground, and there's no doubt that Tahrir Square has become the focal center of that battle that is taking place right now. Inside, there are people that we've seen that have been band-aided up, people that have tied their limbs, just makeshift clinics, really, people lying around with wounds on their heads and stuff, and people trying really to survive. One of the things that they've been doing, and they've established a very good system here, it seems, of ferrying a lot of objects that they can use as projectiles. They've started to break off pieces of the concrete all along the pavement from Tahrir Square, and they're ferrying them to those 5 or 6 entrances that I was telling you about, because they're trying to keep anyone who tries to infiltrate from the outside by pelting them with these stones and some of the metal rods that they've been able to do. They've essentially begun to police themselves by putting up these checkpoints where they're checking everyone who's coming in with bags, and they're checking their IDs. So indeed, this has really become an epicenter of the battle that is taking place not only in Egypt but all across the country. And in fact, the protesters, the anti-government protesters, continue to support, and they've gathered here